This is the text-to-speech audio version of The Observer by Dark Philosopher. To read the full article, including analysis of trends we're observing and other content, check us out on Substack at darkphilosopher.substack.com or anywhere podcasts are broadcast. Article title: Conspiracy: Black Magic in the Modern Era. Article subtitle: To understand the enemy requires understanding of their ideas, beliefs, and system. It doesn't matter if you believe in magic, God, demons, or anything else. The people who believe in these matters believe them wholeheartedly and with such conviction as to cause even the most devoted Christians and preachers to blush in shame at their own failures of faith. Therefore, I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm merely asking you to accept that many others think and act upon these tenets. It is a belief that extends beyond faith to enter the realm of fervor, if not outright conviction of its truths. The study of occult philosophy has existed as long as humanity itself. Whether trappings of the power-hungry, the helpless, or the angst, we have sought and studied these highly guarded ideas and ideals for millenniums, with many of the texts being long lost or quickly forgotten. As is the case with any information that is considered common knowledge, and therefore without the need for common translation or sharing across time. Humans rarely capture things within our texts and drawings that are considered dirt to the common man until that knowledge crosses the divide from duck to ha. There is a standard narrative and warning long forgotten across the potentially thousands of texts, with only hundreds of notable ones. Magic exists. I was skeptical when I started my research down this avenue of study. A self-avowed atheist who found few answers in organized religion and therefore tossed anything along those lines into the same bin of improbability. This form of thinking freed my mind to pursue anything, if not everything, to any rational or irrational conclusion I could. I rarely deny my mind any thought or intrigue that has the potential to produce what I, in my heart of hearts, indeed seek from this world above all else: truth. In the pursuit of endless truths, one quickly finds that truth can be found almost anywhere if one is willing to slog through the infinite drivel of parable, deceit, propaganda, and misdirection, while also declaring war against ego, identity, perspective, and the very limits of rationality and acceptability. This isn't to expressly say that one needs to be a madman to pursue truth, but rather that almost everyone who follows truth to conclusion is inherently mad. As I often remark about the field of psychology and its practitioners, a mind that introspects too far, too deep, and too frequently will endlessly find more of what it seeks and rarely what is sought. For this article, I want you to disband your internal perceptions of the world for a few moments together. I want you to enter my perspective. Accept what I'm saying as probable. And then when you are finished, I want you to disregard everything you have read or heard and pay it as little investigation as possible. I honestly cannot stress this wish for you enough.
Sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Section title: Context. To the initiated, this article will focus primarily on the Abrahamic, pagan, druidic, Luciferian, Masonic, and Egyptology theories underpinning the information. However, there are more texts across other religions and cultures, such as Islamic mysticism, Christian Gnosticism, and the more whimsical Wiccan shadows which might be referenced partly, but I generally exclude. Also, throughout this article, I will utilize standard nomenclature and spelling, which most readers will understand. Section title: Origins. The true origins of the knowledge of magic are, not surprisingly, heavily debated. To some religions, the knowledge of magic was given to man by angels, specifically the Watchers who thought mankind should be allowed these tools. Others have argued that the knowledge of magic was a gift by God to his prophets or by Lucifer to spite God. In other accounts, I've seen mention that magic was introduced by Lilith, the first wife of Adam, after being banished from the garden, presumably also to spite God. Others still believe that it was the meditations and trial and error of the ancient pagans and druids that discovered and shared the tools of magic with mankind. Some even believe these tools were given to only the closest and most devoted followers of the old gods and passed to us through seers, mystics, and maidens of temples long lost to war and decay. Regardless of the true origin, the history and existence of magic, whether through tale or superstition, has existed as long as mankind itself. Throughout history, there have been mentions of these magi, from ancient kings and kingdoms to the Roman Empire. These arts touch every land, culture, and people in one form or another. One could almost say that magic was the first iteration of formal educational study. Section title: Growth of a Spirit. Quote, "We are all children. Unless you choose to grow up, then you are treated as an adult. Within the Christian faith, as an example, they are regarded as children of God. I've taken this to mean that they are spiritual children of God, since the material is immaterial. Which brings me to a warning as it relates to this. Your God might forgive you of your trespasses, but that forgiveness may only extend as far as your innocence can be justified. Thus, be wary of how much you allow your spirit to mature in these matters, as you might be held to a higher standard in judgment. This document is written to give you a perspective that exists in this world. It is not written to teach you its methods. Do not attempt to practice what you are incapable of preaching." Section title: Types of Magic. If we were to categorize magic generally, we would be best served along the white/gray/black visualization. White magic is usually accepted as good, and black magic is generally accepted as evil. For the most part, I'm going to ignore the practitioners of white magic, as these whimsical practitioners are of little interest to my intention here. Though, it is rare when anyone is truly a white magic practitioner. Any attempt at swaying or altering the forces of free will or nature itself could barely be called a selfless act, much like those religious patrons so filled with self-righteousness. Their actions and behaviors almost always tend more towards destruction and suffering than true selflessness. Example, does a soup kitchen genuinely help the poor, or indirectly perpetuate the circumstances of desperation, like a band-aid, which promotes the festering of a wound instead of its healing? The counter-argument from that crowd would likely fall along the lines of, it's all about intention, while ignoring the idea that intention is not inherently moral, and neither are you. Consequence and result are the only valid methods to measure action and intention, and these objective perspectives are unavailable to us mere subjective mortals. Beyond this, many types of magic are better described by their material, act, or purpose than by their specific fields of study. A few of these are: Number 1, blood magic. Number 2, mirror magic. Number 3, summoning magic. Number 4, illusionary magic. Number 5, adult relations magic. Number 6, protection. Number 7, sight. Number 8, demon magic. Expanding this, you get into more pagan, druidic, shamanistic, and other sects of study which have their own rituals and beliefs as reverence for their gods, spirits, protectors, or what have you. For categorization purposes, we can summarize most types into three distinct groups. Number 1, invocation. Number 2, intention and reverence. Number 3, communication. Section title: Sacrifices. Inherently within this sphere, one must give to receive. The type and intensity of giving is proportional to the receiving. More generally, we call these sacrifices, as that is what they are. Whether one sacrifices time, attention, well-being, or one's soul determines the gifts received in kind, though rarely equal in value. Most generally, these are: number 1, negativity. Would generally confer eliciting negative emotions or behaviors in others, or even putting others in harm's way, drawing them away from positive influences, and generally being a jackass, like a Karen but charged with religious fervor and self-righteousness. Number 2, prayer and reverence. They are fairly self-explanatory. Within occultism, one would consider these gifts of time, intention, attention, or will. Whether praying before an altar, clasping a pendant or symbol, or placing one's mindfulness towards a particular deity, demon, or spirit. Number 3, subjective experience. To understand this phenomenon, one must imagine that a god or demon is primarily incapable of experiencing life as we mortals do. Therefore, the acts and pleasures we partake in daily, from the benign of eating and drinking to the sublime of orgasms, rage, or fits of laughter, are, for lack of a better phrase, nectar to the gods. When one is all, the only thing one lacks is the absence of all, which we experience as subjectivity or individual experience. Yet, simply gifting the feeling of a meal or intoxication can only take one so far, as the gift is proportional. On the more extreme end of this value, one must resort to means of depravity, sex, magic, harm, pain induction, or severe absence of necessities such as food, water, or hygiene. For example, imagine yourself a director or producer of a movie with a strong male lead whom you manage to convince to wear traditionally female clothing and high heels. Or perhaps your female actress is convinced to partake in a very violating and degrading scene. In these cases, it isn't so much that the individual performed, but rather that you curated the performance into existence. You might have even gone as far as to corrupt the individual to perform, and from this caused those who witnessed the corruption to be potentially corrupted, creating a chain that can be very powerful. Number 4, corruption. This takes the previous subjective experiences and negative values and turns the dial to 11 at the extreme. In the extreme sense, it is to corrupt the innocent and destroy purity through the induction of depravity or otherwise. On the softer end of the spectrum, it could be to take something meaningful, precious, or beautiful and cause it to be disfigured. Number 5, sacrifice of goods or possessions. Follows along the lines of most horror movies and pop culture. Whether you are gifting a bag of grain to a deity or the firstborn in the village, the proportionality comes from the extremity of the act, such as if the grain gifted was your last or best grain. The most powerful magic comes from the destruction of your most beloved. It is those people who are said to have painted their shoes red. It is written that the most potent ritual that summons the most extraordinary power comes in the form of a combination of all the previous and, therefore, requires the most significant sacrifice from an individual, be it the soul itself and/or your most precious, most loved, most valued possession or creation. An act of evil so selfish as to be unforgivable, as the action must be committed with the knowledge, intention, and determination of the result. To falter is to be lost and have lost. The practitioners of these rituals do not perform them unguided. To folly is to foul. This begs the obvious question. What material gift from this world could ever be worth such a cost, especially if you are explicitly aware that this world is not the final destination? Section title deals with the devil. It has been a running joke among those Hollywood industry types that the means of fame and wealth are not mere accident or skill, but rather something far more sinister. Many talented individuals over the years have been accused and even hinted at a confession that their talent wasn't entirely by birth or training. Though it is impossible to truly verify if such an arrangement is possible without the invocating of something unforgivable. Here is the information I have gathered about this fable. Many people in this world want things. Food, shelter, comfort, fame, wealth, or even women. To want is to be human, as the void within humanity is rarely filled except by the non-material. Meanwhile, there are the few among us who want not a general thing, but a specific thing, and they want it with everything they are. A hunger that is never satisfied, even when the stomach of it is filled to bursting. Many of these people will pursue their appetite with a sociopathic vigor. They will attend the schools, force the connections, and command the results. Whatever it takes. From this group exists a minority of people who also have that hunger, perhaps even a deeper and more dangerous hunger, which can be best described as desperation.
First unwritten law. All must be revealed.
These people, the few who statistically become many across large populations, are so desperate in their hunger that they will give anything and everything to satisfy that empty void. It is here that a deal can be made. Once that hunger roils into desperation, and that desperation is faced with the impossibilities of accomplishment or satisfaction, a man comes to visit. Drawn to the subject like a moth, as this man doesn't make deals with those who waver in their desires. Once this man stands upon your threshold, the rest is a mere formality. One must realize here that the act of a demon, devil, or God pronouncing their existence upon the world or an individual is proof of their existence and therefore the presence of cosmic opposition. As the old saying goes,
The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he doesn't exist.
naturally, if he does exist, so does his counterpart. One might imagine that demons and devils running across the countryside and making themselves known are directly beneficial to strengthening or restoring faith among humanity. The same could be said if the firmament, which the flat earthers claim envelops our sky, was true. A firmament existing is proof of a divine order on the high end of logic, or at the very least, evidence of an order of the world otherwise hidden on the low end. Within this, the more significant question to be asked isn't the mechanics of the deal, but rather the why. Why would such a man visit such a desperate sort of individual? Theoretically, the resolution of desperation is the realization against material desires. Truly, all we materialize isn't worth anything, and the individual is on the cusp of this realization. Suppose such a realization is not the resolution to the desperation. In that case, the individual is more likely to seek a permanent end to the suffering, which fits into the goal of the man who knocks upon desperate doors. But to knock and a deal, the seal is made. A trade of a trinket for the soul of the desperate and hopeless. After this, the terms aren't entirely clear. From what I've gathered, they are bound to the unwritten rules detailed throughout this article. They are punished for transgressions, and I imagine they violate the agreement if they seek any redemption, which I'm not convinced is possible beyond this point. Outside of this, I'm left with mostly questions, such as, Are they forced into possession or have a handler? Must they speak of the arrangement as a joke? Or is that just a dark humor they share? Must they commit to recruitment, grouping, or community service? Is sacrifice or reverence required, or do they continue with their gift and live as they choose? What station in the afterlife do they possess after death? Indeed, there are too many questions and never enough answers. If the devil is ever interested in a conversation, my couch is available. Conversations with the Devil by Dark Philosopher would make a great book title. Section title: Magicians and Seers. A fascinating phenomenon within this context is the magician. On the surface, magicians perform tricks through careful distraction and illusion to make it appear as if something supernatural occurs when it's just smoke and mirrors. The trick is, there is no trick. It's just a trick. These practitioners are usually very astute in the teachings of human nature and psychology, categorized by high levels of self-awareness.
Second, unwritten law. Proof is forbidden to the uninitiated.
The interesting consideration here isn't that these individuals are capable of defrauding us into not seeing the trick, but rather that people capable of understanding the scheme and looking past the illusion can just as easily copy the trick and reproduce its results. Tricksters defrauding other tricksters of their bag of tricks. Don't get me wrong, I love a good magic trick. It's entertaining, it's suspenseful, and it's always puzzling to try and figure out how they accomplished the trick. Because we know these are tricks, they aren't real supernatural effects. Except it takes much more than just a few replicable tricks to make it from street magic to Las Vegas headliner. It's at this point things get interesting. Every headlining magician has a signature set of tricks that make them stand out from the crowd of thousands who can do exactly what they do. These tricks elevate performers from shuffling cards on the sidewalk to performing for thousands. Signature tricks that truly mystify and are otherwise difficult to explain, but not impossible, which is the key. The trick to these tricksters is plausible deniability. There must be a logical explanation for the trick beyond the supernatural. If one can't envision a logical explanation for the trick, then the trick is magical, and the proof of the supernatural is forbidden. Every trick must have a built-in explanation. Throughout my research and entertainment across many years at this point, I have only ever seen two tricks that defied most explanation. One involved a man pulling a loaf of bread out of his hand in the middle of a busy cafe. The other was overly dramatic, involving the aging of a young girl into a grown woman. In both cases, we can explain the trick. Trapdoors, mirrors, sleight of hand. That, dear reader, is the point. To captivate, to mystify, and then to puzzle. That is genuinely the trick of the trickster, which itself invalidates any potential events of actual supernatural occurrence, presently or historically, which may occur by accident or otherwise. Remember, it's just a trick. From here, I've gathered this much. A magician is taught the craft, and if he is astute, he is allowed to practice it and, with some luck, launch himself into fame and fortune, and that's where the magic stops. Once too many eyes are upon the magician, he must perform only tricks for the crowd. It is my understanding he is taught in the ways of showmanship, and it's up to him to keep the show running and stay relevant. I've gathered that these individuals are abandoned at this point, where the agreement is now satisfied. This begs the question, why would a supernatural being teach someone how to perform magic tricks if they aren't actual magic? The reason varies among faiths and organizations, but flows along one of two ideas. Number one, the performing of tricks is a mockery of God and his prophets, such as the alleged miracles of Jesus Christ. Number two, The performance of tricks trains humanity to not believe things they can't understand or to seek logical explanations for things that mystify the mind and thereby demystify them. Seers is a little more inexplicable. There seem to be specific individuals who can traverse the veil, though rarely are ever given training and therefore suffer losses of ability as they age, most pronounced after puberty. Though it has been declassified that the CIA many years ago had recruited these types of individuals for government espionage, which naturally calls forward the visuals of that classic Tom Cruise movie I Minority Report, it was inferred that the programs related to this field were unsuccessful, wherein the seers were able to produce results only slightly more accurate or consistent than guesswork. There are dozens of stories and reports of local police stations working with these types of individuals in missing persons cases and murders. Historically, there are many accounts of fortune tellers, oracles, and seers. The two most famous were Nostradamus, born 1503 and died 1566, and Sibyl of ancient Greece. In recent times, we have the accounts of Edgar Cayce, born 1877 and died 1945, among others. In more modern times, I understand that seers and ritualistic vessels are curated instead of discovered. In extreme cases, it's usually orphans who are tragically abducted or gifted by families for favors when they show an aptitude for those purposes. Under the instruction of a trained psychoanalyst, they undergo a process of traumatic breaking of the psyche into multiple parts, the self and the vessel, where the vessel can be triggered or induced, while the memories of their actions are effectively locked away behind a trauma wall. The reasoning for this is to ensure the vessel, which pays vital witness and is a tool of summoning and council rituals, isn't driven into madness after years of abuse. Secrecy is also paramount among those groups, as a vessel having such intimate knowledge of members and means breaking from their handler into the public would be devastating. Over the years, law enforcement has rescued many of these innocent victims, and their stories are truly heartbreaking, though they rarely can recall formal details of their abuse. The therapeutic illustrations they draw of monsters and horrors are seemingly fairly accurate and collaborative across many cases. Section title: Demon Magic. Here lies the most sacred, secret, and, dare I say, scary forms of magic, which is also the most powerful. Where all other forms of magic require the practitioner to appease a deity, this form of magic attempts to force that favor if performed correctly. The actual methods and means of this form of magic are buried deep within the minds of men who never speak, texts never translated, and vessels locked behind walls of trauma otherwise unreachable. It is truly the most compelling of all the types and the most well-known in popular culture, as the images of a drawn pentagram in this article demonstrate. Though I would never attempt such a ritual, especially since the suggested offerings required are illegal and managing a vessel for the ceremony is diabolical, to say the least. It's important, I think, that you can begin to understand capability, to better understand the possibility, or at the very least the belief of those practitioners. The primary usage of these ceremonies among those groups is not to command a legion or spite an enemy. Instead, to pull into our world beings that can never and must never be released here. They negotiate with the being for information, warning, and counsel through offering or favor. Though the results can be mixed. Sometimes a lesser being is sent. Other times a less valuable being arrives. That being said, the main goals of these elaborate ceremonies are to achieve one of the following: to fetch the forgotten, to tell of secrets unknown, to destroy what is known, to reveal what is lost. Furthermore, as alluded to, the targets of these ceremonies are not mere demons in legion, as the fictional stories would have us believe. They are gods from our perspective, being so powerful and beyond comprehension that we are less than ants from their viewpoint. We are more akin to harmless bacteria, unseen, unnoticed, and easily washed away. From what I've gathered, these lesser deities, though far above and far away, want nothing more than to be unleashed here. In exchange for favors, those practitioners offer willing hosts to the lesser among them. Beyond this base layer of information, things get relatively muddled between the sects and texts. Some claim that we are in a war that was started before time itself and will continue until long after time has stopped. Others claim that it wasn't always like this, and that the gods themselves are in competition for the devotion of lesser beings, whereby prayer and reverence are breathed to gods, the lack of which is death. The more modern equivalent suggests these gods rule along cycles of thousands of years, where they alone can set the chessboard and laws of reality for their purposes. At this point, we have entirely crossed the realm of rational probability and entered into fantasy from our perspective, so let me draw your attention instead to something interesting. Section title: Possession. Outside of pop culture and the Catholic Church possessions, marked by dramatic and violent displays, there exists within the realm of possession other forms. It can be said that most forms of possession are instances of mental illness, which is a point correctly iterated by many interviews with exorcist practitioners. To explain it, I need to clarify a potential misconception you might have, dear reader, which is demons don't necessarily want to be feared. Some want to be revered. Isn't that the truth of even men? That most of us want to be liked and accepted as we are. This isn't to say that demons are merely some misunderstood spirits. As far as we can tell, they are in pursuit of the destruction of man by one means or another. So, if they can't get you by consent, they will take you by deceit. This brings us to the other form I've inadvertently discovered: willful possession through reverence.
Unwritten law. The subject must be willing or abdicate.
This particular tidbit is about a girl who we shall call Rebecca. Rebecca wasn't a particularly notable girl, but was otherwise of a friendly and easygoing demeanor. Strong, but soft. Rebecca grew up in a small town just outside of a large city in a modest house with a backyard encroached by a dozen-acre forest. As she tells it, she would spend most of her time in that forest as a child in imaginative play. Most of her friends lived in the city, which she was bused to during the week for school. Rebecca's parents got a divorce when she was fairly young due to her father suffering from health concerns. Her father was a hunter who worked odd construction jobs when available. Along with carpentry projects, he would sell out of the garage. Rebecca took after her father in many respects, assisting him often. As I recall her telling it, Rebecca started to collect feathers and bird skulls when she was young, taking a fascination with such things. She later graduated to collecting porcupine quills, claws, and other oddities, especially from randomly encountered roadkill. Then, sometime around the divorce of her parents, she elevated her passive paganism into something a lot darker. As she explained it, though scant with the details, she prayed for a friend, someone to comfort her during this challenging time, and something answered. Her friend's name was Belial, whom she spoke very fondly of. When pressed about the relationship, she often became vague and hesitant. However, she did confess to having had certain relations with the friend during her teenage years. As our relationship matured, it became reasonably clear that she was a pathological liar in the most clinical sense. Most disturbingly, her lying wasn't geared towards avoiding confrontation, but, in effect, about everything and anything. As I joked after I broke up with her, I could have held up a photo of her in a green sweater and asked what color it was, and she would have testified with certifiable certainty that the sweater was blue. What was most odd of this behavior was her reaction, where sometimes she would appear to take great enjoyment in lying, and other times she seemed very distraught. If not conflicted, though just as equally committed to the tales she weaved. Most likely mental illness, though given some of the odd things that occurred during our relationship, I am inclined to disregard that diagnosis, even though I can't rationalize beyond the immediate likelihood. Her mother later collaborated on the odd childhood behavior, including the many nights when Rebecca would stay up late in her room talking to no one, prompting her mother to burst into the room on several occasions, convinced there was a boy on the threshold. As you can most certainly ascertain yourself, Belial is the name of a demon within the lesser keys of Solomon, the second manifestation after Lucifer and one of the kings of hell. Belial is the representative of deceit and lies. Looking back on this time, I am almost convinced that the only truth Rebecca ever told me during our relationship was about her childhood and her invisible friend, which was later confirmed, too much embarrassment, by her mother. Even to this day, I am convinced that Rebecca truly believes the account, as it was the only thing she ever told me of any length where I didn't suspect her of lying. If we are to assume this was a possession of another sort, how interesting it is that the attributes of the revered are transferred to the subject through reverence. Most telling this possible conclusion is when one accounts for other faiths and followers, especially among the Abrahamic variety. Section title: Modern Magic. Black magic in the modern era gets slightly more complicated than in the past. These organizations are incredibly well-funded, well-connected, and well-versed. While law enforcement does manage to wrangle small organizations or exiled members in abandoned warehouses and trailer parks, the actual organizations and their networks and structures are far more elaborate. As an example, towards the order of magnitude, estimates suggest child trafficking revenues are upwards of $44 billion a year, with billions of that being domestic. And that's just one element of the above, which itself deserves an entire article, if for no other reason than to bring to light the sheer magnitude of the networks of these perversions and the insurmountable funding they receive, despite the claims that banking regulations stem the tide of such activities. Our understanding of psychoanalytic psychology has significantly increased over the last century, leading to stronger bonds and better understanding between handlers and vessels. At the same time, our knowledge of symbology drifts further into the distant past. Our overarching systems are less threatened than in previous times. No longer do temples get torn down in wars and regime changes. Trinkets are not stolen, only accumulated. Passage between ports is seamless, not suspect. If the public ever becomes aware, the pagans and witches will be thrown to those wolves, as it was only a few centuries ago on these lands. In this modern era, normalization is once again sought over secrecy. Some strive to bring these tricks out of the shadows and into the churches to beguile you if you attend those places, or the research laboratories for those who don't. These attempts at proliferation have been done before in order to deliver you to an unknown. All other attempts throughout history have failed, given that insurmountable force called human nature and spirit, which is difficult, if not impossible, to modify. Within this time, this modern period and moving forward, never has mankind been so capable of being fooled and mystified. Never have the whispers between individuals been subject to censorship. Never have the institutions and traditions been so apt to sway and falter so quickly. Never has evidence gathered been so inexplicably deleted without a trace. While Christians endlessly claim that this period is the coming rapture, the Israelites endlessly work in their attempts to rebuild Solomon's temple in that land, and the Muslims march forward in their consummation efforts. Meanwhile, the churches aspel the same narratives as the press, while the government pronounces aliens exist, which could very well be demons of another title. To what extent can the public understand these teachings, technologies, and systems? It is not inherently clear. Assuming everything in this document is true, and most of it is true to those who believe it, which tends to be the most powerful among us? It is not inherently clear if the new religion of science will provide explanations if the world ever starts to wake. It's not inherently clear if the tricks will become bigger and more mystifying as technology gives more excuses befitting reason. It's not inherently clear. This is the end of the text-to-speech audio version of The Observer by Dark Philosopher. For more content, including our trends analysis, see our Substack at darkphilosopher.substack.com, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future articles. As always, farewell and good luck. Signed, Dark Philosopher.